Hello, and welcome to the National Book Festival from the Library of Congress. My name is Guy Lamolinar, and I work at the library. I'm here today with David Kamp, whose featured book at the festival is Sunny Days, the Children's Television Revolution That Changed America. David has also pre-recorded a video for us, and if you'd like to learn more about David's book and hear what he has to say about it, you can watch it at nationalbookfestival.com. And David is appearing on the Family, Food, and Field stage. Welcome, David, and thanks for being here.
Guy, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Great. Let's begin. Tell us a bit about your book. How did you become interested in writing about children's television and the golden age of kids' TV?
Well, the idea came about 5 years ago in 2015. And even then, I sensed a certain brokenness to American society that we just weren't feeling good about ourselves, even though 2015 right about now sounds like paradise. So I started thinking about, I wanted to write an American history book about what I would call a successful chapter in American ingenuity, where like-minded people put their heads together to realize change and through hard work and grit actually succeeded. And I'm a child of that era. I was a toddler in 69 and 70. And I looked at this aggregation of shows like Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Zoom, The Electric Company, Free to Be You and Me. And I started to realize that they weren't just a slate of programming, that they together constituted a social movement. And so I thought, let me write about that as a little sliver of American history that has a positive outcome.
Great. Did you realize when you were a child that you were watching something revolutionary, or did that come to you as you became older?
I mean, the one weird thing, Guy, is that I never stopped thinking about these shows. Meaning, of course, when I was 4 and 5, I wasn't aware of anything being revolutionary, because who is at that age? But I couldn't get out of my head, even when I was in high school in the 1980s, that really was an extraordinary period in terms of recognizing the emotional intelligence of children, kind of recalibrating how we thought about American childhood and how we thought about representation, multiculturalism. And sort of the older I got, the more I realized that this period was kind of unprecedented before and even since, in terms of the sheer volume of what I would call innovative and progressive thinking about American childhood.
Did you come to a point where you stopped watching the shows as you grew older, or are you still watching?
Well, inevitably you do. Like inevitably there's an age where you kind of think you're too cool and you're too old. Like Sesame Street's corny. Mr. Rogers is corny. Free to Be You and Me. Oh my God, a doll. William wants a doll. That's corny. We would ridicule those things at adolescent age. But then as you get older, you realize this is genius. And then when you have your own kids and you see how pertinent and useful it is in rearing your own children with the values you hope to impart to them. So yeah, I mean, it's only appreciated in value as I've gotten older, the worth of these programs.
What do you attribute this golden age to? Why was it at this particular time in history all these newfound shows found an audience?
Well, it was a confluence of factors. One was that TV was this growing force, much like the internet is this all-encompassing force that's reshaped our lives in the last 20 years or so. Another thing is that we were coming out of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society era, when in the mid-60s you had the Civil Rights Act pass, and you had the Elementary and Secondary Education Act pass, and you had the Corporation for Public Broadcasting being passed into law or into existence. And on top of that, psychology, and specifically child psychology, was increasingly accepted as a legitimate field of inquiry, as opposed to quackery, as many people thought the social sciences were in the old days. Mm-hmm. And so suddenly you have all these things coming together. And you also have activism, 60s activism. Joan Gans Cooney and Lloyd Morissette, the people who co-created Sesame Street, their original goal was not for Sesame Street to be for all preschool kids. It was specifically aimed at giving kids a leg up who were from disadvantaged backgrounds, mostly Black kids in the inner city in the initial years of Sesame Street. So you had that level of activism informing things too. So all these things came together at once to create this incredibly fruitful period.
What about the future of educational TV? Do you think it's moving away from television and will be in an app or a game, or do you think e- educational TV is still relevant today?
Well, I think all of the above, meaning we know from this improvised approach to remote learning that we've had to muddle through these last few months, that this is a semi-new normal, that even if we get over this pandemic in the next 12 months, for at least a generation, this is always going to be in the back of our minds, that we could go into lockdown again, we could go into remote learning again. So I think it's pretty realistic that we're going to have to really devise a curriculum that does happen via apps and websites. But also, guys, since you brought up broadcast television, you've got to remember that a lot of people still don't have access to high-speed internet. They don't have access to state-of-the-art laptops and hardware. So broadcast TV still is an amazing medium through which to disseminate really good quality edutainment kind of equitably. And I think that's something we really have to look at more strongly going forward, is good old PBS and broadcast television, disseminating really good quality educational content.
You mentioned the pandemic. Do you think these shows have received increased viewership due to the pandemic and people being cooped up inside their houses more? I don't know if you follow TV ratings at all.
No, I don't. But what I would say is that I've gotten a lot more inquiries as I've been discussing this book about screen-based learning, and saying, and the parallels are there, because when in 69 and 70, when Sesame Street was being launched into the universe, there was a lot of intellectual nose holding about television being this malign influence and how could it possibly be used to educate people. And Sesame Street and the Children's Television Workshop basically proved that if you put enough rigorous preparation into it, you really could succeed in educating kids. And we're kind of experiencing the same thing now, where a lot of people are just saying, that the internet is a malign influence, and it just turns kids' brains into zombie Wheatina. Really bad choice of words there, but nevertheless, that it's that this is all bad. Screen-based learning is all bad, and the fact is that if you put enough rigor and thought into it, it can work. And Sesame Street and the Electric Company proved that it could work.
What was the response to these shows initially? Did many people watch them? Did they have to build up an audience over time?
Well, I think, Guy, that it was a different era when I think there was more public goodwill and public buy-in. So even before Sesame Street premiered on November 10th, 1969, there was a big publicity launch for it, and especially to get it, to create awareness for Sesame Street among Black viewers. And I mean, because you already had a baseline of public TV viewers who were basically middle class and affluent white people, but how to reach the original target audience. And the ingenuity of the Children's Television Workshop, which is now called the Sesame Workshop, in having literal promotional vehicles driving around the street. They convinced Con Ed, the New York-based utility, to drive trucks around in Black neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy and Harlem and say, we've got this show. And they would have TVs with tapes of Sesame Street, test episodes, in the Con Ed vehicles. They handed out leaflets at a football game in the fall of '69 between two historically Black colleges, Morgan State and Grambling State. Something like 50,000 leaflets, just so that, because there was no internet back then. And so that's how people became aware of Sesame Street. So from day one, November 10th, '69, there was a built-in audience that was ready to embrace this. And if anything, the backlash only came later on when, Sesame Street was such a success that anything in America that becomes big and successful invites scrutiny and backlash. So to answer your question, the initial reaction to Sesame Street and the Electric Company was more or less a warm embrace.
How about today? Do you see any new shows coming on board that you think will have the same effect on society as Sesame Street or some of these other shows did?
I think we live in such an atomized media landscape that nothing is ever going to have, we were in kind of a monoculture back then where like everyone watched the same 4 TV channels and listened to the same top 40 radio. So I don't know if any one thing can have the impact that Sesame Street had in the early 70s. But all that said, it can be done again. I don't think anyone's really attempted. There's a lot of good children's programming out there, but I don't think like Paw Patrol or Peppa Pig, they're good shows, but they don't have the ambition of Sesame Street. Sesame Street was this massive undertaking that was also public-private. Its initial budget of $8 million a year to produce an astounding 130 hours of television a season. That was half underwritten by the federal government. $4 million of that $8 million. The federal government, to a magnitude not seen before or since, was in the TV production business. And that I asked Lloyd Morissette if that could ever happen again. He said, not with this government, but it could happen again. I mean, I honestly think it's something that should be on the table. Should there be more federal investment in screen-based learning, since we know we have to live with it for a while?
You mentioned earlier in your conversation about the creators of Sesame Street. Can you tell us a little about their background, how they came to create the show? Did they meet any resistance when they were trying to sell it?
Well, the creators were Joan Gans Cooney, who got her start in TV production, TV publicity at CBS in the 50s, but then she really wanted to make documentaries addressing poverty. So her issue wasn't even children, it was poverty. And she met this guy, Lloyd Morissette, through a mutual friend. Well, it was Lloyd's cousin and her friend, her cousin and Lloyd's friend, Julian Gans, introduced them. And together, Lloyd Morissette was working for the philanthropic Carnegie Corporation. And they had a dinner party where Lloyd Morissette was saying, I am trying to address early childhood education and the inequities and how it's distributed, basically. Like there are bad inner city schools and good public schools in the affluent suburbs. And Joan Gans Cooney's issue was more, how can I use TV to alleviate the effects of poverty, to get the word out about good programs? They combined their two ideas, and out of that became the 3-year process that gave us Sesame Street. Now, I just want to talk about that 3-year process, because part of it was studying educational methods, but part of it was also recruiting seasoned entertainment professionals like Jim Henson, who was already a big deal by the age of 30. He was already a millionaire guy who was a successful ad man, successful puppeteer, successful maker of short films. And they got a bunch of guys from Captain Kangaroo, the children's TV program on network TV, CBS, John Stone, who was the chief showrunner of Sesame Street in the early days. And John Stone, again, was a guy who wanted to really make it in commercial TV. He wanted to graduate from kids TV, meaning Captain Kangaroo, to writing sitcoms for CBS. But the big point is that these brilliant minds from the entertainment world also doubled down on this idealistic commitment to educational TV. And John Stone said that that was Joan Gans Cooney's masterstroke, was not to try to turn teachers into entertainers, but to turn entertainers into teachers. And by doing that, by pulling together academics as consultants, but having entertainment people do the actual TV part, that's what made Sesame Street so persuasive and successful and watchable, not just to little kids, but to the parents and guardians who are watching along with them.
You spoke about government funding a little while ago. Do you think government funding is the only way to promote the production of these types of shows to all demographic groups?
Well, it certainly wouldn't hurt, because if there's sort of a federal mandate, a coordinated response to the shortcomings in our educational system, that goes a long way to the FCC was more activist in those days too, and it never issued there were never any laws passed saying that you must air this much TV, but there were these kind of loosely enforced mandates that the FCC put out to broadcasters saying, like, you should have a certain amount of programming that serves the public interest. And that was enough to make even the commercial networks comply with some educational programming. And on top of that, I would say, I think we need to put out more of a call to the entertainment industry to say, hey, you guys are needed too. You need to do your bit to advance the cause of educational TV and screen-based learning, because what we're doing isn't enough right now. We know we're going to have to live with screen-based learning at least for another couple of years probably, and probably forevermore to some degree. So let's get the entertainment industry involved. Your salaries might not be as good. Rita Moreno, who starred on the Electric Company, she said to me that being on the Electric Company was public service in every aspect of the word public, including the salary. But what she meant by that, so obviously she meant the pay was not comparable to what she made being Anita in West Side Story or working with Mike Nichols in the movie Carnal Knowledge, for example, or the Rockford Files, which she also did in the 70s. But she still said, I think it's the best thing I've ever done. She had a daughter the same age as me, and she said, I just looked at my daughter, and she said, all of my actor friends, when I got the offer to do the Electric Company, to a person were saying, don't do it, because you'll be forevermore pigeonholed as just a children's performer. Your career will never recover. Well, Rita Moreno's still doing network TV. She's doing One Day at a Time with the reboot with Norman Lear right now.
That's
so
right.
Obviously it didn't adversely affect her career. And more to the point, it's probably, or at least arguably, the thing that Rita Moreno is best known for, is being on the Electric Company. So the point is sometimes, and the point I'd want to get out to people in the TV industry is that sometimes following your ideals and is actually the answer to having the best career. It's not about what's the most lucrative or what's the most flashy. It is just following what feels right will lead you down the right path. And Rita Moreno is a testament to that.
Okay, here's a fun question. Do you have a favorite Sesame Street character? And if you do, why?
Well, mine is, I talk about him a lot in the book. Mine is Roosevelt Franklin, who is a Muppet character who is discontinued. He was invented by Matt Robinson, who was a writer and producer on the show, and also with the original actor who played Gordon, the paternal black figure. And he said we needed a Muppet character who kind of represented black experience and black English and black behavioral affect. He said, the kids watching at home need to have a character, black kids watching at home need to have a character who they recognize. They see themselves in that character. And so Roosevelt Franklin was this more dynamic, I don't know, he was just brilliant. Like he sang these funky songs about the alphabet and counting, and he was voiced by Matt Robinson. Atypical for a Muppet in that he wasn't developed by Jim Henson or Frank Oz or any of the other puppeteers, but he just had this brilliance and spirit, and they had these really great songs that were almost like Stax Records, R&B soul songs, and I loved him. Every other kid in the universe loved him, but within Sesame Street, he was controversial. Within the executive ranks of Sesame Street, specifically the black executive ranks of Sesame Street, because he spoke in a sort of quote-unquote street vernacular. Because Matt Robinson said it was important that kids learned that not all legitimate English is what he called 6 o'clock news English. And Roosevelt Franklin spoke in a kind of jive speak. I think that was part of the reason he got across to us. But within, there was a more bourgeois black contingent within the ranks of the Children's Television Network who thought, that's the image of American blackness that we're trying to get away from. And Joan Gans Cooney was a great listener, and she was great at hearing both sides of the argument. And generally, she came down on the correct side in terms of long-term cultural impact. But this is a rare case where I think she made the wrong choice and chose to phase out Roosevelt Franklin. But to those of us aficionados of Roosevelt, go down the YouTube rabbit hole and watch all the Roosevelt Franklin videos you can. He's a little purple guy. He's fantastic. You'll love him.
Here's a question. Can you comment on educational programming's move to pay TV?
Yeah, the optics of it are not good. So I think what that question is alluding to is that Sesame Street, new episodes of Sesame Street now launch on HBO. And I think there's kind of a 9-month period where new episodes are exclusive to HBO before they're then moved over to PBS where they're widely accessible. Now, HBO, or HBO Max, I guess we call it now, we all know that's a premium streaming service now. So again, the optics aren't good because this is a program that was invented to address the most marginalized and resource-deprived kids. Of course, it reaches all kids now. But as Lloyd Morissette put it to me, again, he's one of the co-founders with Joan Gans Cooney of the program, our revenue streams had dried up. You have to remember that for a long time, so much of Sesame Street's revenues came from sales of DVDs, sales of toys, and that stream has dried up, just like how record sales have dried up as a revenue stream for musicians. And so the choice was between having Sesame Street on HBO or having no Sesame Street. So if you weigh those factors, if you make a pro and con list on a yellow legal pad, it's pretty obvious why you would be pro the show being on HBO right now.
Let's talk about some of the other programs that you have written about, such as Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. How did Fred Rogers come to have his own show?
What's interesting about Fred Rogers is that he, like Joan Gans Cooney, both worked in network TV as young people in the 50s. Fred Rogers was at NBC, Joan Gans Cooney was at CBS, and they both felt a religious calling. It was faith in the most generous sense of the term faith. Fred was a devout Presbyterian who would later be ordained as a Presbyterian minister. Joan Gans Cooney was part of a group, a progressive Catholic group called the Christophers, and they both recognized TV as this medium through which they felt they could address children. Well, initially for Joan Gans Cooney, it was poor people, but it later became poor children. For Fred Rogers, it was, how can I use this new medium of television to reach children and address their emotional intelligence, basically. They basically say, Sesame Street was more explicitly curricular. Let's learn how to count to 20. Let's learn the alphabet. Let's learn about rural environments versus urban environments. Mr. Rogers was more about emotional intelligence. Let's let kids learn how to deal with anger, deal with anxiety, deal with abject joy, deal with even things like insecurity about being able to keep their pee in. He famously had one episode where he took a water hose and held it over a fish tank for something like 1 minute, which in TV time is an eternity. No TV producer would ever sanction this now. But he said, and there were real psychological underpinnings to this. It's just to show kids that a vessel can contain fluids. Psychologically crosses over into a kid's mind into an innate understanding that therefore I can contain my fluids. And the other thing about Fred Rogers is he wasn't this uncommonly kind, decent man. He also was someone who was deeply interested in child psychiatry and had a consultant he worked with for the entire duration of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, a Pittsburgh child psychiatrist named Dr. Margaret McFarland, who helped him incorporate these deeply researched psychological lessons into his programming, his curriculum.
I take it from what you say that Fred Rogers was the same off camera as he was on.
Yeah, very much so. And I find what's interesting now is we've all come to this moment where we all love Fred Rogers. He was the subject of the documentary Won't You Be My Neighbor a couple of years ago. And last year, Tom Hanks played him in the feature film It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. But again, to go back to one of your earlier questions about did you grow out of these shows, there was a period when I found Fred Rogers completely corny and laughable, and we all did. I mean, we all did for a while. We thought Fred Rogers was corny. Eddie Murphy did Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood. Christopher Guest did a parody of him on some National Lampoon records in the 70s. I think what we've all come to recognize now was that he was, as Tom Junot, who wrote the Esquire article that was the basis for the Tom Hanks movie, Tom Junot, who's a friend of mine, said, Fred Rogers was the face of radical kindness, radical empathy. And I think as we live in this more fractured, polarized society, we've all kind of come to realize that that kind of radical kindness is something we need to sort of get ourselves back in touch with. How did that man pull it off? How did he carry it off? It wasn't by being wimpy. It was actually by being very willful and strong-minded. And I think that's why people are sort of reconnecting with him posthumously right now.
Okay, here's a question going back to Sesame Street and its origins. Did the creators and producers, promoters of Sesame Street meet any resistance or hesitation from the Black community, considering that this was a show created by white people? And how did they research the needs of their original target audience?
Well, first of all, Sesame Workshop, even though the two people who conceived of it, Lloyd Morissette and Joan Gans Cooney, were white, Joan Gans Cooney was pretty shrewd early on in saying, like, I can't do this by myself. And so there were a lot of people involved, like Matt Robinson, who I said didn't just play Gordon. He was a producer and writer on the show. And there was a consultant named Jane O'Connor, who was a school teacher and was one of the formative consultants. And there was a community outreach person named Evelyn Payne Davis. She was the one whose job it was to create awareness of Sesame Street in urban environments, not just in New York City, but also in Oakland, in Dallas, Texas, in Chicago. And she had representatives, most of whom came out of Black organizations like the Urban League, to make sure that awareness of Sesame Street was promoted in 69, 70, when you have to remember, much like people don't have access to like Mac laptops and broadband Wi-Fi now, a lot of people didn't have access to color TVs. So there was this infrastructure within the Children's Television Workshop, mostly formed by Black individuals, many of them of parent age, wherein Sesame Street was made available in churches, in Ward 8 in Washington, D.C., even in a 7-Eleven. They were determined to have these Sesame Street viewing centers all across American cities. But to answer the question of did Sesame Street encounter some resistance from Black people saying, like, who are you to talk about, our experience? Of course. Yeah, I mean, there was some blowback, and New York Magazine ran an article in the early 70s about how a lot of people said Sesame Street painted too rosy a picture of Black life or inner city life, like that the set should be dirtier, or that the experience there should be people with drug and alcohol problems walking across the screen. And Lloyd Morissette said that they actually contemplated painting a picture of Sesame Street that was more like that, but everything in their research told them not to, because part of what the Sesame Street experience was meant to be for kids watching at home, and particularly Black kids watching at home, was aspirational. That, hey, that stoop looks like a stoop in my neighborhood, but it's a stoop where people of all races and different age groups are interacting. Mr. Hooper, the old shopkeeper who in John Stone's mind, John Stone created him, was an old Jewish man, and Gordon and Susan were a Black couple. And then you have this white guy, Bob, coming through. And then, just to go to your question of criticism, the Latin community was like, where are we? They were kind of really angry for 2 seasons. And then, and Joan Ganscuni, again, was willing to admit, oh my God, I got that wrong. I ignored the concerns of a huge segment of our audience. And that's why you had Sonia Manzano come on in season 3 as Maria, and Emilio Delgado come on as Luis. And they were both on the show for 40 odd years. And again, that was where a lot of people, not just white viewers, but Black viewers, really acclimated to the Hispanic experience for the first time.
Great. I'm sorry, but we just have time for one more question. And the question is, what do you think of the longevity of educational children's programming? Do you think it has a future?
I think it totally does, because for the myriad factors we've discussed today, that we know now that this is a new semi-normal, that we're going to have to live with screens. And so rather than, there's nothing that's ever going to replace in-person learning, pupils and teachers. Nothing's ever going to be better than that. But at the very least in a supplemental way, and at the most in sort of a Head Start program way, because Sesame Street was a sibling to Lyndon Johnson's Great Society Head Start program, which was aimed at giving inner city kids a leg up when they entered kindergarten. We know that we're going to be in this situation for a long time, where there's inequities in the educational system, and just across the board, parents are saying, oh my God, how am I supposed to teach my kid at home? So I think more and more, we need to get more ambitious about what our screen content is vis-a-vis educational programming. It has to be more entertaining. It has to be more thorough. It isn't just for preschoolers. It probably has to go all the way up through senior year in high school, that we're going to have more screen-based learning, not as a replacement for in-person learning, but as a really important supplement. So I think all systems go, more investment, public and private, in educational programming.
Okay, I promised one more. If you could tell us in about 30 seconds, what is your research and writing process? Do you keep quote unquote business hours?
No, what writer does. Although research, one research process is interview everyone old as fast as you can before they die. Joan Gans Cooney and Lloyd Morissette are both 90 years old. So when you're writing about something that happened 50 years ago, you make sure you reach people. And fortunately, they're very much with us. Some people did pass away. And the other thing is archives. Everyone love your librarians because they're there to help you. And there's all these amazing open and closed collections where librarians are just waiting to help you out. And without the National Archives and the Children's Television Workshop Archive at the University of Maryland, this book would have been nothing. So I just want you all to love your librarians, and especially for the National Book Festival, give your librarians love. I urge you.
David, thank you. This has been such a pleasure. I wish we had another half hour to talk, but unfortunately we don't.
We'll all be here next year.
Great. I hope so. We've been talking with David Kamp, who's the author of Sunny Days, the children's television revolution that changed America. And if you want to hear more from David and listen to his video, which he recorded exclusively for the book festival, you should go to the Family, Food, and Field stage and log on at nationalbookfestival.com. I also want to take a moment to thank our audience. Thank you for your wonderful questions, and I hope you'll take some more time to explore our programs and the remainder of the festival.